Hey there, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into one of the most incredible transformations our planet has ever experienced. Picture this, a world where massive reptilian titans had ruled for over 150 million years suddenly goes silent. And from that silence emerges something completely different, something smaller, warmer, and ultimately more resilient than anything that came before. We're talking about the rise of mammals, but not the cute furry creatures you might be thinking of. This is the story of how Earth became a completely alien world, where the rules of survival were rewritten from the ground up. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to walk through a landscape where every ecosystem was rebuilding itself, where new forms of life were experimenting with designs that had never existed before, then you're in for something special. Now, before we jump in, if you find these deep dives into Earth's ancient history as fascinating as I do, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. And if you're new here, consider subscribing because we explore these incredible moments in Earth's timeline every week. So let's set the scene. We're traveling back roughly 66 million years ago to a moment that changed everything. The Cretaceous period had just ended in the most dramatic way possible, and the Paleocene epoch was beginning. This wasn't just another chapter in Earth's story, this was a complete reboot of life itself. The world that emerged from this transition was nothing like the one we know today. Imagine walking through landscapes where familiar concepts like grass didn't exist yet, where flowering plants were still relatively new inventions, where the very air you breathed contained different concentrations of gases, creating a greenhouse effect that made the entire planet significantly warmer than it is now. But here's what makes this period absolutely fascinating. For the first time in Earth's history, small, warm-blooded creatures weren't living in the shadows anymore. They weren't hiding from giant predators or competing for scraps. They had inherited an entire planet, and they were about to do something extraordinary with it. The mammals that survived the Great Extinction weren't impressive by today's standards. Most were no larger than modern shrews or rats. They had sharp little teeth designed for crunching insects, keen senses adapted for navigating darkness, and most importantly, they possessed something revolutionary: the ability to maintain their own body temperature regardless of external conditions. This might not sound groundbreaking, but think about what this actually meant. While reptiles needed to bask in sunlight to become active, mammals could hunt, forage, and explore during the cool nights when their competitors were sluggish. They could venture into regions too cold for other animals. They could remain active during seasonal changes that would shut down entire reptilian ecosystems. Endothermy, as scientists call this internal temperature regulation, was like having a built-in furnace that never went out. Every cell in their bodies was a tiny engine burning fuel to generate heat. This required them to eat more frequently than cold-blooded animals, but it gave them unprecedented freedom to explore and exploit new environments. The early Paleocene world was perfect for these capabilities. Global temperatures were climbing steadily, creating a greenhouse effect that extended tropical and subtropical conditions far beyond what we see today. Forests stretched almost to the poles. There were no ice caps, no frozen tundras, just endless expanses of lush vegetation under humid skies. But this wasn't a stable paradise. The climate was fluctuating wildly as Earth's systems recovered from the catastrophic disruption. Volcanic activity was releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Ocean currents were reorganizing themselves. Weather patterns were chaotic and unpredictable. In this unstable world, flexibility became the ultimate survival trait. Mammals possessed this in abundance. Their diets could shift between insects, fruits, seeds, and small animals depending on what was available. Their behavior could adapt to new threats or opportunities. Their reproduction strategies allowed them to increase populations quickly when conditions improved. The fossil record from this period tells us that mammalian diversity exploded at an unprecedented rate. Within just a few million years, creatures that had been limited to a handful of basic forms began branching into dozens of new lineages. Some developed longer limbs for running across open ground. Others evolved gripping hands for climbing through the expanding forests. Still others began experimenting with aquatic lifestyles along coastlines and riverbanks. What's remarkable is how quickly these changes occurred. Evolution, which typically operates over millions of years, was accelerated by the wide-open ecological niches left vacant by the extinction. Every empty role in the ecosystem was an opportunity waiting to be filled, and mammals were uniquely equipped to fill them. Take the development of different tooth structures, for example. Early mammals had relatively simple dental arrangements designed for basic omnivory. But as they began specializing for different diets, their teeth rapidly diversified. Some species developed flat grinding surfaces perfect for processing plant material. Others evolved sharp cutting edges for slicing meat. Still others created complex arrangements for cracking nuts and seeds. These weren't random mutations. Each dental innovation was tested against the environment and either proved successful or disappeared. The mammals that survived were those whose tooth designs matched available food sources. Over time, this created distinct feeding guilds that would persist for millions of years. The sensory capabilities of these early mammals were equally impressive. Living in a world where survival often depended on detecting threats or opportunities in darkness had given them extraordinary sensory acuity. Their hearing could detect frequencies and subtle vibrations that no reptile could perceive. Their sense of smell could track chemical trails across vast distances and distinguish between hundreds of different scents. These heightened senses weren't just useful for finding food or avoiding danger. They became the foundation for increasingly complex social behaviors. Mammals began communicating through subtle vocalizations, scent marking, and body language that conveyed information about territory, reproductive status, and individual identity. The development of fur represented another revolutionary adaptation. This wasn't simply insulation for maintaining body temperature, though that was certainly important. Fur created a living sensory network that could detect the slightest changes in air pressure, temperature, or moisture. Each hair follicle was connected to nerve endings that transmitted information about the immediate environment. Specialized hairs, called vibrissae, or whiskers, became particularly sophisticated sensory instruments. These could detect air currents around objects in complete darkness, essentially allowing mammals to navigate by feeling the shape of their surroundings. This tactile sensitivity gave them a three-dimensional awareness of space that no other vertebrate group possessed. But perhaps the most transformative adaptation was the evolution of mammary glands and milk production. This innovation completely changed the relationship between parents and offspring. Instead of laying eggs and abandoning them to environmental chance, mammals could provide continuous nourishment and protection to their young. Milk wasn't just food, it was a complex biological substance containing proteins, fats, sugars, and antibodies, specifically tailored to support rapid growth and immune system development. This allowed mammalian young to develop in protected environments while their nervous systems matured and their learning capabilities expanded. The ability to learn from parents and peers became increasingly important as environments grew more complex. Young mammals could acquire knowledge about food sources, predator behavior, and environmental hazards without having to rediscover everything through trial and error. This cultural transmission of information gave mammals a significant advantage over species that relied solely on genetic programming. As we move forward in this series, we'll explore how these early innovations set the stage for some of the most dramatic evolutionary developments in Earth's history. We'll see how mammals went from small insect eaters hiding in burrows to massive creatures that would reshape entire continents. We'll discover how they conquered the oceans, mastered flight, and eventually gave rise to species capable of conscious thought and technological innovation. The world was warming, the forests were expanding, and life was experimenting with possibilities that had never existed before. What happened next would determine not just the fate of mammals, but the entire trajectory of complex life on Earth. Life on Earth. The transformation wasn't happening in isolation. While mammals were diversifying at breakneck speed, the planet itself was undergoing massive changes that would shape their evolutionary trajectory for millions of years to come. The continents were slowly drifting into new configurations, ocean currents were reorganizing, and atmospheric chemistry was fluctuating in ways that created entirely new environmental pressures. During the Paleocene, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were significantly higher than today, sometimes reaching concentrations 3 to 4 times greater than current levels. This created what scientists call a super greenhouse effect, where global temperatures averaged about 8 to 12 degrees Celsius, warmer than modern conditions. There were no polar ice caps whatsoever. Instead, temperate forests extended all the way to the Arctic Ocean, and even Antarctica supported lush vegetation. This warm, humid world was perfect for the rapid diversification of plant life, which in turn provided new opportunities for mammalian evolution. Flowering plants, which had appeared during the Cretaceous but remained relatively uncommon, suddenly began spreading across the landscape. These angiosperms brought with them a revolution in food availability. Fruits, nuts, and nectar became abundant resources that mammals could exploit in ways their predecessors never could. The coevolution between mammals and flowering plants created feedback loops that accelerated diversification on both sides. As mammals developed better color vision to locate ripe fruits, plants evolved brighter, more attractive displays. As mammals became more efficient seed dispersers through their digestive systems, plants developed fruits specifically designed to appeal to mammalian preferences. Some of the most successful early mammalian groups were the multituberculates, often called the rodents of the Mesozoic, despite not being closely related to modern rodents. These creatures had developed highly specialized teeth, with multiple rows of cusps that could efficiently process plant material. Their success was so complete that they dominated mammalian ecosystems for over 100 million years, making them one of the longest-lived mammalian lineages in Earth's history. The multituberculates showcased one of the key strategies that would define mammalian success: dental specialization. Unlike reptiles, which typically have relatively uniform teeth throughout their mouths, mammals evolved differentiated dental systems with incisors for cutting, canines for gripping, and molars for grinding. This allowed them to process a much wider variety of food sources than any previous vertebrate group. Alongside the multituberculates, early placental mammals were beginning their own remarkable diversification. The condylarths, primitive ungulates that would eventually give rise to hoofed mammals, appeared during this period. These early herbivores were still relatively small, typically weighing between 10 and 50 kilograms, but they represented the first experiments in large-bodied plant-eating among mammals. The condylarths developed elongated skulls and specialized grinding teeth that allowed them to process fibrous vegetation more efficiently than their smaller relatives. Their limb bones show adaptations for cursorial locomotion, meaning they were becoming better at sustained running across open ground. This was particularly important as forest canopies began to open up in some regions, creating the first grassland-like environments. Predatory mammals were evolving in parallel with their herbivorous prey. The creodonts, an extinct group of carnivorous mammals, developed during the Paleocene and quickly became the dominant predators in many ecosystems. Unlike modern carnivores, creodonts had a different arrangement of carnassial teeth, the specialized shearing teeth that allow efficient meat processing. Some creodont species grew quite large for Paleocene mammals, with the largest reaching sizes comparable to modern wolves. They developed powerful jaw muscles and robust skulls that could deliver crushing bites to subdue prey. Their limb proportions suggest they were ambush predators rather than pursuit hunters, relying on stealth and explosive power rather than endurance. The evolution of predator-prey relationships during this period established patterns that would persist throughout mammalian history. As herbivores developed better defenses, predators evolved more sophisticated hunting strategies. As predators became more efficient, herbivores developed enhanced sensory capabilities and escape behaviors. This evolutionary arms race drove innovation on both sides and contributed to the rapid diversification of mammalian forms. One of the most significant developments during the late Paleocene was the appearance of the first true primates. These early primates, known as Plesiadapiforms, were quite different from modern primates, but showed several key adaptations that would define the lineage. They had grasping hands with opposable digits, forward-facing eyes that provided stereoscopic vision, and enlarged brain cases relative to their body size. The evolution of stereoscopic vision was particularly important because it allowed precise depth perception, which was crucial for navigating three-dimensional arboreal environments. As forests became denser and more vertically complex, the ability to judge distances accurately when leaping between branches became a matter of survival. Early primates also showed evidence of enhanced manual dexterity. Their hands could manipulate small objects with precision, allowing them to extract insects from bark crevices, select ripe fruits, and eventually use simple tools. This manipulation ability was supported by expanded areas of the brain dedicated to processing tactile information from the hands. The social behavior of these early primates was likely more complex than that of other contemporary mammals. Living in trees required coordination and communication to avoid conflicts over resources and territory. The evolution of more sophisticated vocalizations and facial expressions began during this period, laying the groundwork for the complex social systems that would characterize later primate evolution. Meanwhile, in aquatic environments, mammals were beginning their gradual transition back to life in the water. The earliest ancestors of whales, known as mesonychids, were terrestrial predators that hunted along shorelines and riverbanks. These wolf-sized animals had elongated skulls and powerful jaws adapted for catching fish and other aquatic prey. The mesonychids showed several adaptations that would later prove crucial for aquatic life. Their dense bones provided ballast for diving. Their elongated snouts reduced water resistance, and their powerful hind limbs generated thrust for swimming. While they were still primarily terrestrial, they spent increasing amounts of time in shallow water pursuing prey. The transition from land to water wasn't sudden or dramatic. It occurred over millions of years through gradual modifications that improved aquatic performance while maintaining terrestrial capabilities. This incremental approach allowed populations to exploit both environments simultaneously, reducing the risks associated with complete habitat transitions. Climate fluctuations during the late Paleocene created additional evolutionary pressures that shaped mammalian development. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a period of rapid global warming that occurred about 56 million years ago, saw global temperatures spike by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius over just a few thousand years. This sudden warming caused massive changes in ocean chemistry, weather patterns, and vegetation distribution. Many mammalian lineages responded to this climate crisis through rapid evolutionary changes. Body sizes generally decreased, following Bergmann's rule, which states that animals in warmer climates tend to be smaller to improve heat dissipation. Teeth became more specialized for processing the changing vegetation. Migration patterns shifted as species tracked favorable habitats across the landscape. The thermal maximum also triggered one of the most significant mammalian migration events in Earth's history. Land bridges exposed by changing sea levels allowed mammals to disperse between continents that had been separated for millions of years. North American and European mammalian faunas mixed for the first time since the breakup of the supercontinent, leading to rapid evolutionary changes as species encountered new competitors and prey. During this period of environmental upheaval, mammals demonstrated the flexibility that would become their defining characteristic. Unlike previous dominant groups that had relied on specific environmental conditions, mammals could adjust their behavior, physiology, and ecology in response to changing circumstances. This adaptability would prove crucial as Earth continued its long journey toward the ice ages that would define the later Cenozoic. The foundation was being laid for everything that would follow. In forests that stretched from pole to pole, small mammals were perfecting the innovations that would eventually allow their descendants to grow into giants, master the oceans, and develop the cognitive abilities necessary for conscious thought. The age of mammals wasn't just beginning, it was accelerating toward possibilities that no previous era had ever imagined. The world that emerged from the thermal maximum was unrecognizable from anything that had existed before. As global temperatures stabilized at their new elevated levels, mammalian evolution entered what can only be described as an experimental phase, unlike anything in the history of complex life. The rules that had governed vertebrate existence for hundreds of millions of years were being rewritten in real time. Picture walking through these ancient landscapes, and you'd encounter creatures that seem almost impossible by modern standards. The forests were filled with sounds that no human ear has ever heard. The rustle of leaves as primitive horses the size of house cats bounded through undergrowth. The calls of early whales that still retained functional legs and hunted in shallow coastal waters. The territorial disputes of saber-toothed predators that were just beginning to experiment with enlarged canine teeth. What made this period so remarkable wasn't just the diversity of forms that were appearing, but the speed at which they were evolving. Evolutionary changes that typically required tens of millions of years were happening in just a few million. The empty ecological niches left by the extinction were being filled so rapidly that paleontologists can track major morphological changes between fossil deposits that are separated by less than 1 million years. One of the most fascinating aspects of this rapid diversification was how mammals began experimenting with size. For over 150 million years, mammals had been constrained to small body sizes by competition with dinosaurs. Now, freed from those constraints, they began testing the limits of how large a warm-blooded vertebrate could become. The first experiments in mammalian gigantism appeared during the Eocene epoch, roughly 56 million years ago. Uintatherium, a massive herbivore that lived in North America, reached sizes comparable to modern rhinoceroses. These creatures had bizarre skull ornamentations, including multiple pairs of bony protuberances and elongated canine teeth that resembled tusks. But Uintatherium was just the beginning. As mammals continued to exploit the advantages of large body size, they developed innovations that would define herbivorous mammals for the rest of Earth's history. Large bodies provided better defense against predators, improved thermoregulation in varying climates, and most importantly, allowed for more efficient digestion of plant material. The digestive challenges of herbivory drove some of the most sophisticated evolutionary solutions we see in mammals. Unlike carnivores, which can extract nutrients relatively easily from meat, herbivores must break down complex plant compounds like cellulose and lignin that are essentially inedible to most animals. Early large herbivores solved this problem by developing extended digestive tracts with specialized compartments where symbiotic bacteria could ferment plant material. This bacterial fermentation process was revolutionary because it allowed mammals to access energy sources that were essentially unlimited. While carnivores were constrained by the availability of prey, herbivores could exploit the vast plant biomass that was spreading across the warming planet. This energy advantage helps explain why herbivorous mammals often grew larger than their carnivorous contemporaries. The evolution of complex digestive systems also had unexpected consequences for mammalian intelligence. The bacterial fermentation process produces various compounds that can affect brain chemistry, and some researchers suggest that the co-evolution between mammals and their gut bacteria may have contributed to the development of enhanced cognitive abilities. Meanwhile, carnivorous mammals were facing their own evolutionary pressures. As herbivores grew larger and developed better defenses, predators had to become more sophisticated hunters. This led to the evolution of some truly remarkable predatory adaptations. The creodonts developed into apex predators that dominated Eocene ecosystems across North America and Eurasia. Andrewsarchus, discovered in Mongolia, may have been the largest terrestrial mammalian predator that ever lived. Conservative estimates suggest it weighed over 1,000 kilograms, making it larger than any modern bear. Its skull alone was nearly a meter long, equipped with massive teeth capable of crushing bone. Unlike modern large predators that rely primarily on claws and teeth, Andrewsarchus appears to have used its sheer bulk and powerful jaws to overwhelm prey. These early predators were experimenting with hunting strategies that had never existed in the vertebrate world. Some developed pack hunting behaviors similar to modern wolves. Others became solitary ambush predators that relied on stealth and explosive power. Still others developed semi-aquatic lifestyles, hunting both in water and on land. The diversity of predatory strategies was matched by an equal diversity of defensive adaptations among prey species. Some herbivores developed thick, armored skin that could resist predator attacks. Others evolved enhanced speed and agility for escape. Many developed sophisticated social behaviors including alarm calls, cooperative defense, and coordinated group movement. One of the most significant developments during this period was the emergence of true social cooperation among mammals. Unlike reptiles, which typically live solitary lives except during mating, mammals began forming complex social groups with hierarchies, communication systems, and cooperative behaviors. The evolution of sociality was closely tied to the development of enhanced parental care. Mammalian mothers were investing unprecedented amounts of time and energy into raising their offspring, teaching them essential survival skills through direct instruction and example. This extended learning period allowed young mammals to acquire complex behaviors that couldn't be programmed genetically. The social groups that formed around these extended family units became increasingly sophisticated. Members developed individual recognition systems based on scent, vocalization, and visual cues. They established territorial boundaries through scent marking and vocal displays. Some species even showed evidence of cooperative hunting and food sharing. These social innovations had profound implications for brain evolution. The cognitive demands of living in complex social groups selected for enhanced memory, communication abilities, and social intelligence. Brain sizes began increasing across multiple mammalian lineages, not just in primates, but in carnivores, herbivores, and even some smaller mammals. The relationship between social complexity and brain evolution created a positive feedback loop that accelerated cognitive development throughout the mammalian world. As brains became more capable, social behaviors became more sophisticated, which in turn selected for even larger and more complex brains. While these developments were occurring on land, equally dramatic changes were happening in aquatic environments. The transition from terrestrial to aquatic life represents one of the most remarkable evolutionary transformations in the history of vertebrates. The early stages of this transition can be traced through a series of intermediate forms that show progressive adaptations for life in water. Ambulocetus, whose name literally means walking whale, lived about 49 million years ago in what is now Pakistan. This 4-meter-long predator retained functional legs for terrestrial locomotion, while developing adaptations for aquatic hunting. Its elongated skull and powerful tail suggest it was equally comfortable pursuing prey on land or in shallow water. The sensory adaptations that allowed these early whales to hunt effectively underwater were particularly sophisticated. Their inner ears were modified to detect sound transmission through water rather than air, giving them directional hearing capabilities in aquatic environments. Their eyes were repositioned to provide better vision while swimming, and their nostrils began migrating toward the top of their skulls. Perhaps most remarkably, these early aquatic mammals were developing echolocation capabilities that would eventually rival those of any animal that has ever lived. By producing high-frequency sounds and interpreting the returning echoes, they could navigate and hunt in murky water conditions where vision was useless. The evolution of echolocation required sophisticated modifications to both sound production and sound reception systems. The skull had to be restructured to focus acoustic signals. The inner ear had to be modified to process complex acoustic information, and the brain had to develop new neural pathways for interpreting echolocation data. These acoustic abilities gave early whales a tremendous advantage in aquatic environments. They could detect prey, navigate complex underwater topography, and communicate with other members of their species across vast distances. The songs of early whales may have been among the first long-distance communication systems in the mammalian world. As we examine this period of explosive mammalian diversification, it becomes clear that we're witnessing the establishment of patterns that would define vertebrate evolution for the next 50 million years. The basic body plans, sensory systems, social structures, and ecological relationships that emerged during the Paleocene and Eocene would provide the foundation for everything that followed. The mammals weren't just filling empty niches left by the dinosaurs. They were creating entirely new ways of being a large vertebrate on planet Earth. They were pioneering innovations in thermoregulation, parental care, social cooperation, and cognitive ability that had never existed before. They were transforming Earth's biosphere from a collection of independent organisms into an interconnected web of relationships and dependencies. But even as these remarkable innovations were spreading across the planet, new challenges were beginning to emerge on the horizon. The climate that had been so favorable for mammalian diversification was starting to show signs of instability. Volcanic activity was increasing, atmospheric chemistry was fluctuating, and the first hints of long-term cooling trends were becoming apparent in the geological record. The mammals had conquered a warm, forested world, but that world was about to change again. How they would adapt to these new challenges would determine not just their own fate, but the entire trajectory of complex life on Earth. The stage was being set for the next great chapter in the mammalian story, one that would test every innovation and adaptation they had developed during their remarkable rise to dominance. The cooling that began during the late Eocene wasn't gradual or gentle. It was a climatic shift that would fundamentally restructure life on Earth, and mammals found themselves facing challenges that would test every adaptation they had developed over the previous 20 million years. Global temperatures began dropping as atmospheric carbon dioxide levels declined, triggered by increased weathering of newly formed mountain ranges and changes in ocean circulation patterns. This wasn't just a matter of putting on a winter coat. The cooling planet was creating entirely new types of environments that had never existed during the mammalian rise to dominance. For the first time since the age of dinosaurs, ice began forming at the poles. Seasonal temperature variations became more extreme. Most dramatically, the endless forests that had covered the planet from pole to pole began fragmenting into isolated patches separated by something completely new: grasslands. The emergence of grasses represents one of the most significant ecological revolutions in Earth's history. These seemingly simple plants possessed a revolutionary adaptation that allowed them to thrive under conditions that would kill most other vegetation. When grazed or burned, grasses could regenerate from their base, rather than having to regrow from seeds or shoots. This made them virtually indestructible under the right conditions. As grasslands spread across the cooling continents, they created selection pressures that no mammal had ever faced before. The lush forest canopies that had provided protection and abundant food were disappearing. In their place were vast open spaces with scattered food resources and nowhere to hide from predators. Mammals had to completely reinvent how they lived, hunted, and survived. The first major adaptation to grassland life was the evolution of cursorial locomotion, essentially the ability to run fast and efficiently across open ground. Forest mammals had been adapted for climbing, jumping between branches, and navigating dense vegetation. Grassland mammals needed to cover vast distances quickly, either to escape predators or to pursue prey across featureless plains. This drove dramatic changes in limb structure across multiple mammalian lineages. Leg bones became longer and more robust to support sustained running. Feet evolved from broad, grasping structures into narrow, efficient platforms for propulsion. Many lineages developed hooves, which provided better traction on hard ground while reducing the energy cost of locomotion. The evolution of hooves was particularly significant because it represented a complete commitment to terrestrial life. Unlike claws, which could be used for climbing or digging, hooves were specialized exclusively for running on solid surfaces. Species that developed hooves were essentially betting their entire evolutionary future on the persistence of open grassland environments. Early horses provide a perfect example of this grassland adaptation. Hyracotherium, the earliest known horse ancestor, lived in Eocene forests and was about the size of a small dog. It had 4 toes on its front feet and 3 on its back feet, perfect for navigating soft forest floors. But as grasslands expanded, horse evolution accelerated rapidly. By the Oligocene epoch, horses had grown significantly larger and their feet had begun consolidating into fewer, stronger digits. Mesohippus had 3 toes on each foot, but the middle toe was bearing most of the animal's weight. This trend continued through the Miocene with species like Merychippus, which was approaching the size of modern horses and had developed high-crowned teeth specifically adapted for grinding abrasive grass. The dental adaptations required for grass consumption were just as dramatic as the locomotory changes. Grass contains microscopic silica particles that act like sandpaper on teeth. Animals that tried to eat grass with the low-crowned teeth that worked perfectly well for forest vegetation would literally wear their teeth down to useless stumps within a few years. The solution was the evolution of hypsodont teeth, high-crowned molars that continued growing throughout the animal's lifetime to compensate for constant wear. These teeth had complex folded surfaces that created multiple grinding ridges, allowing more efficient processing of tough grass fibers. The development of these dental innovations allowed mammals to tap into the vast energy resources represented by grassland vegetation. But grasslands didn't just change how mammals moved and ate. They fundamentally altered predator-prey relationships in ways that drove rapid evolutionary innovation on both sides of the equation. In forests, predators could rely on ambush tactics, using dense vegetation for concealment. On open grasslands, stealth became nearly impossible, forcing the evolution of new hunting strategies. Some predators responded by becoming pursuit hunters, developing the speed and endurance necessary to run down prey in open country. Others evolved pack hunting behaviors using coordination and intelligence to overcome the disadvantages of hunting in the open. Still, others became specialized for hunting at dawn and dusk, when low light levels provided some concealment. Prey species faced equally intense selection pressures. Without trees to climb or dense vegetation to hide in, they had to develop new defensive strategies. Many species evolved enhanced sensory capabilities, particularly vision and hearing, to detect predators at greater distances. Others developed sophisticated alarm call systems that could warn entire herds of approaching danger. The evolution of herding behavior itself represents one of the most significant behavioral innovations in mammalian history. By grouping together in large numbers, individual animals could reduce their personal risk of predation while gaining the benefits of many eyes and ears watching for danger. But herding also required the development of complex social behaviors and communication systems. Large herds needed leadership structures to coordinate movement and decision-making. They required recognition systems to distinguish group members from outsiders. Most importantly, they needed mechanisms for maintaining group cohesion while allowing individuals to compete for resources within the group. These social innovations drove another round of brain evolution as mammals developed the cognitive capabilities necessary for complex group living. The ability to recognize dozens or hundreds of individual group members, remember social relationships, and navigate complex hierarchies selected for enhanced memory and social intelligence. Meanwhile, the cooling climate was creating new challenges that went far beyond adapting to grassland life. Seasonal temperature variations meant that mammals living in higher latitudes had to develop strategies for surviving winter conditions that could last for months. This led to the evolution of several remarkable physiological adaptations. Hibernation emerged as one solution to the problem of surviving extended periods of cold and food scarcity. Species that developed the ability to dramatically slow their metabolism during winter could survive on stored body fat when external food sources were unavailable. This required sophisticated modifications to cardiovascular, respiratory, and nervous system function. Migration represented another approach to dealing with seasonal climate variations. Species that developed the ability to track favorable conditions across vast distances could avoid the worst effects of winter by following warmth and food availability. But migration required navigational abilities that were unprecedented in the mammalian world. The development of magnetic field detection, stellar navigation, and landmark recognition systems allowed mammals to undertake journeys of thousands of kilometers with remarkable precision. These navigational abilities were supported by modifications to sensory organs and brain regions specialized for processing spatial and temporal information. Some mammals took a different approach entirely, developing thick, insulating fur and behavioral adaptations that allowed them to remain active throughout winter. These species evolved the ability to cache food during abundant seasons, creating stored reserves that could sustain them through periods of scarcity. The evolution of food caching required not just the physical ability to gather and store resources, but also the cognitive capabilities necessary to remember cache locations and monitor their contents. This selected for enhanced spatial memory and planning abilities that would prove crucial for later mammalian evolution. As grasslands continued expanding and climates continued cooling, mammals were also dealing with the geological forces that were reshaping the continents themselves. The collision between India and Asia was creating the Himalayan mountain range, which began altering global weather patterns in profound ways. The rising Himalayas created a rain shadow effect that contributed to the aridification of Central Asia, leading to the expansion of grasslands and the eventual formation of the first true deserts in millions of years. This created new selection pressures that favored mammals capable of surviving with minimal water and extreme temperature variations. Desert adaptations drove the evolution of sophisticated water conservation mechanisms. Kidneys became more efficient at concentrating urine, reducing water loss. Behavioral adaptations like burrowing during the day and being active at night minimized exposure to heat and dehydration. Some species even evolved the ability to extract water from their food, eliminating the need to drink free water entirely. The formation of the Isthmus of Panama, which connected North and South America for the first time in over 100 million years, triggered one of the most significant faunal exchanges in mammalian history. Species that had evolved in isolation on separate continents suddenly found themselves in direct competition with completely unfamiliar lineages. This great American biotic interchange resulted in rapid evolutionary changes as species adapted to new competitors and prey. Many South American lineages, which had evolved in isolation, were unable to compete with the more recently evolved North American forms and went extinct. However, some South American groups, particularly edentates like armadillos and sloths, successfully colonized North America. The constant environmental changes of this period created what evolutionary biologists call a Red Queen scenario, where species had to continuously evolve just to maintain their position in the ecosystem. This relentless evolutionary pressure drove innovation at an unprecedented rate and established the foundation for the remarkable diversity of modern mammalian fauna. By the end of the Miocene epoch, roughly 5 million years ago, mammals had successfully adapted to virtually every terrestrial environment on Earth. They had conquered grasslands, deserts, mountains, and forests. They had developed strategies for surviving extreme seasonal variations and had established complex social systems that rivaled anything seen in the modern world. But even as mammals reached this pinnacle of diversity and ecological success, new challenges were beginning to emerge on the horizon. The cooling trend that had driven so much evolutionary innovation was about to accelerate dramatically, ushering in the ice ages that would define the final chapter of mammalian evolution before the rise of human civilization. The stage was set for the emergence of the megafauna, the giant mammals that would come to dominate the Pleistocene epoch. These creatures would grow to sizes that dwarfed anything seen since the age of dinosaurs, and their story would intertwine with the early chapters of human evolution in ways that continue to shape our world today. The transformation of Earth from a warm, forested planet to a world of grasslands, deserts, and ice was nearly complete. The mammals that had once hidden in the shadows of dinosaurs had not just inherited the Earth, they had fundamentally restructured it according to their own biological imperatives. What happened next would determine whether they could maintain their dominance as the planet entered its most climatically unstable period in over 60 million years. The ice ages that began around 2.6 million years ago didn't arrive as a single dramatic event. Instead, they came in waves, each one testing the adaptations mammals had spent millions of years perfecting. These weren't just periods of cold weather, they were complete reorganizations of the planet's climate system that would advance and retreat in roughly 100,000-year cycles, creating a world of constant environmental upheaval. During glacial maximums, ice sheets up to 3 kilometers thick covered vast portions of North America and Europe. Sea levels dropped by over 120 meters, exposing land bridges that had been underwater for millions of years. The Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America, allowing species to migrate between continents that had been separated since the breakup of ancient supercontinents. These climate oscillations created what paleontologists call the Pleistocene pump, a mechanism that repeatedly fragmented and reconnected populations, driving rapid evolutionary change. When ice advanced, species were pushed into southern refugia, where they evolved in isolation. When ice retreated, these populations expanded northward and encountered relatives they hadn't seen for hundreds of thousands of years. The mammals that thrived during this period were those that could handle not just cold, but constant change. Body size became a crucial adaptation for surviving glacial conditions. Larger animals could store more fat reserves to survive extended periods of food scarcity. They could also retain body heat more efficiently, following the principle that volume increases faster than surface area as objects grow larger. This drove the evolution of some of the most magnificent creatures ever to walk the Earth. Mammoths emerged as the ultimate Ice Age specialists, their massive bodies covered in dense woolly coats that could insulate them in temperatures far below freezing. Their curved tusks weren't just for defense or display. They were sophisticated tools for scraping snow away from buried vegetation and stripping bark from trees during the harshest winter months. The mammoth's trunk represented one of evolution's most versatile innovations, containing over 40,000 individual muscle units that could perform tasks ranging from delicate manipulation of small objects to powerful excavation of frozen ground. Their teeth were equally specialized, with complex ridged surfaces that could efficiently grind the coarse grasses and sedges that dominated Ice Age landscapes. But mammoths weren't the only giants adapting to this frozen world. Woolly rhinoceroses developed their own suite of cold weather adaptations including a thick horn that may have been used for clearing snow and a compact body plan that minimized heat loss. Giant cave bears evolved in European mountain regions, growing to sizes that dwarfed modern grizzlies, while developing omnivorous diets that allowed them to survive in environments where pure carnivory would have been unsustainable. The predators that evolved alongside these giants were equally impressive. Cave lions grew larger than any modern big cat, developing hunting strategies specifically adapted for pursuing massive prey across open tundra landscapes. Saber-toothed cats reached their evolutionary pinnacle during this period, with species like Smilodon fatalis developing canine teeth over 18 centimeters long and jaw muscles powerful enough to deliver killing bites to the thickest-skinned megaherbivores. These elongated canines weren't designed for the pursuit hunting that characterizes modern big cats. Instead, they were precision instruments for delivering fatal wounds to specific anatomical targets. Saber-toothed cats were ambush specialists that relied on stealth and explosive power to overwhelm prey that could weigh several times more than they did. The evolution of pack hunting reached new levels of sophistication during the Pleistocene. Dire wolves developed social behaviors that allowed them to coordinate attacks on prey much larger than themselves. Their robust skulls and powerful jaw muscles were adapted for crushing bone and accessing the nutrient-rich marrow that could sustain a pack through lean periods. These pack hunters weren't just cooperating for individual hunts. They were sharing information about prey movements across vast territories, coordinating their activities with other packs, and even engaging in complex territorial negotiations that minimized conflict while maximizing hunting efficiency. The herbivores that served as prey for these formidable predators had to develop equally sophisticated defensive strategies. Giant ground sloths evolved thick, bony armor embedded in their skin that could deflect even the most powerful predator attacks. Their massive claws, originally adapted for pulling down tree branches, became defensive weapons capable of inflicting serious damage on any predator that ventured too close. Glyptodonts took armor to its logical extreme, evolving into living tanks with shells that could weigh over 400 kilograms. These massive armadillo relatives were virtually invulnerable to predator attacks once fully grown, but their defensive strategy came at the cost of mobility and energy efficiency. The most successful Ice Age herbivores were those that combined size with speed. Giant bison developed the endurance necessary for long-distance migrations across changing landscapes, following seasonal vegetation patterns that could span thousands of kilometers. Their ability to break trail through deep snow allowed smaller species to follow in their wake, creating migration corridors that supported entire ecosystems. These migration patterns became so regular and predictable that they shaped the evolution of predator behavior across multiple species. Wolves learned to anticipate migration routes and timing, positioning themselves along traditional pathways to intercept prey. Even scavengers like giant condors evolved flight patterns specifically adapted for following migrating herds and feeding on animals that died during the journey. The Ice Age world was also characterized by remarkable examples of convergent evolution, where unrelated species independently developed similar solutions to environmental challenges. In North America, short-faced bears evolved into massive pursuit predators with long legs adapted for chasing down prey across open terrain. In South America, terror birds filled a similar ecological niche, using their powerful legs and massive beaks to hunt large mammals. These convergent solutions demonstrate the predictable nature of evolutionary responses to specific environmental pressures. When ecosystems provide similar challenges, natural selection tends to produce similar adaptive solutions, regardless of the starting genetic material. The cognitive demands of Ice Age survival also drove significant advances in mammalian intelligence. Species that could learn complex migration routes, remember the locations of seasonal food sources, and adapt their behavior to changing environmental conditions had significant survival advantages over those that relied solely on genetic programming. This period saw the evolution of some of the most sophisticated non-human intelligence ever documented in the fossil record. Proboscideans developed complex social structures with matriarchal leadership systems, where older females guided herds based on decades of accumulated environmental knowledge. Their ability to remember drought patterns, seasonal variations, and the locations of emergency food sources allowed them to survive environmental fluctuations that would have decimated less cognitively advanced species. The development of tool use also accelerated during this period, though most examples involved simple modifications of existing objects rather than the manufacture of complex implements. Some proboscideans learned to use sticks for scratching hard-to-reach areas or for testing the depth of water crossings. Certain primate species developed the ability to modify stones for cracking nuts or processing plant materials. These early examples of tool use were significant not because of their complexity, but because they demonstrated the cognitive flexibility that would become increasingly important as environmental conditions continued to fluctuate. Species that could modify their behavior and even their material culture in response to changing circumstances had a significant advantage over those that were locked into rigid behavioral patterns. The Ice Age climate also created opportunities for some truly remarkable evolutionary experiments. Island populations that became isolated by changing sea levels often evolved in directions that would have been impossible under normal continental conditions. Dwarf mammoth populations on Mediterranean islands evolved body sizes less than 1/10 that of their mainland relatives, demonstrating the speed with which mammals could adapt to resource-limited environments. Conversely, some island species evolved toward gigantism when freed from competition and predation pressures. Giant rodents, oversized deer, and massive flightless birds appeared on isolated land masses where the normal constraints of continental ecosystems didn't apply. These island experiments provided natural laboratories for understanding the factors that control mammalian evolution under different environmental conditions. They demonstrated that the size and behavioral patterns we associate with specific mammalian groups are highly plastic and can change rapidly when selection pressures shift. The repeated cycles of glacial advance and retreat also created conditions that promoted species longevity while simultaneously driving innovation. During glacial maximums, species were pushed into refugia, where small populations could persist for hundreds of thousands of years with minimal evolutionary change. But when climate conditions shifted and these refugial populations expanded, they encountered new environmental challenges that drove rapid adaptive evolution. This combination of stasis and rapid change created a unique evolutionary dynamic that maximized both species survival and adaptive innovation. The result was a mammalian fauna that was both ancient in its basic adaptations and remarkably modern in its ability to respond to environmental challenges. As the Pleistocene progressed and Ice Age cycles became more pronounced, the stage was being set for the emergence of a species that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of mammalian evolution. The cognitive advances, social behaviors, and adaptive flexibility that had evolved in response to Ice Age challenges were creating the foundation for intelligence of an entirely different order. The world of giant mammals was approaching its zenith, but it was also approaching a transformation that would reshape not just mammalian evolution, but the entire biosphere. The next chapter in this story would involve not just adaptation to environmental change, but the emergence of a species capable of consciously directing environmental change for the first time in Earth's history. The emergence of early humans during the late Pleistocene wasn't just another evolutionary development. It represented a fundamental shift in how intelligence could shape the natural world. While other mammals had developed remarkable cognitive abilities for navigation, social coordination, and environmental adaptation, humans possessed something unprecedented: the capacity for cumulative cultural evolution. This meant that knowledge gained by one generation could be preserved, modified, and transmitted to the next without relying solely on genetic inheritance. A technique for knapping stone tools could be refined over thousands of years, with each generation adding small improvements that accumulated into sophisticated technologies. This cultural transmission allowed human populations to adapt to new environments far more rapidly than biological evolution alone would permit. The archaeological record shows that early human populations were remarkably successful at exploiting Ice Age environments. They developed specialized hunting techniques for pursuing megafauna, including coordinated drives that could channel entire herds toward kill sites. These hunting strategies required not just individual skill, but complex social coordination involving dozens of people working together with precise timing. The development of projectile weapons represented a crucial technological breakthrough that fundamentally altered predator-prey relationships in Ice Age ecosystems. Spear throwers, or atlatls, allowed hunters to deliver projectiles with force and accuracy that exceeded anything achieved by natural biological systems. This gave humans the ability to hunt animals much larger than themselves while maintaining safe distances from dangerous prey. But human impact on Ice Age ecosystems went far beyond hunting. The controlled use of fire allowed humans to modify entire landscapes in ways that favored certain species while disadvantaging others. Regular burning of grasslands prevented the encroachment of woody vegetation, maintaining open habitats that supported large grazing animals. This landscape modification created a feedback loop where human activity actually increased the carrying capacity for many megafauna species. The relationship between humans and Ice Age megafauna was complex and varied significantly across different regions and time periods. In Africa, where humans and large mammals had co-evolved over millions of years, stable predator-prey relationships persisted throughout the Pleistocene. Both humans and megafauna had developed behavioral adaptations that allowed them to coexist with relatively minimal mutual impact. However, when human populations expanded into previously uninhabited regions like Australia and the Americas, the ecological consequences were more dramatic. The megafauna in these regions had no evolutionary experience with human predation and lacked behavioral adaptations for avoiding human hunters. This naive behavior made them particularly vulnerable to exploitation by technologically sophisticated human populations. The extinction patterns that occurred during the late Pleistocene were unlike anything seen in previous geological periods. Rather than affecting all size classes equally, these extinctions were heavily biased toward large-bodied species. Animals weighing more than 45 kilograms were disproportionately likely to disappear, while smaller mammals generally survived with minimal impact. This size-selective extinction pattern suggests that multiple factors were working together to create pressure on large mammals. Climate change was altering habitat availability and food resources, while human hunting was adding additional mortality pressure specifically targeted at the largest species. The combination of these factors created conditions that many megafauna lineages simply couldn't survive. The disappearance of large herbivores had cascading effects throughout Ice Age ecosystems. Without massive grazers to maintain open grasslands, many regions experienced rapid forest expansion that altered local climate conditions and soil chemistry. The loss of large predators that had specialized in hunting megaherbivores created opportunities for smaller predator species to expand their ecological roles. These ecosystem changes weren't instantaneous, but they were remarkably rapid by geological standards. Pollen records show that some regions experienced complete vegetation shifts within just a few centuries of megafauna extinctions. Lake sediment cores reveal changes in nutrient cycling and erosion patterns that coincided with the loss of large trampling and grazing animals. The survivors of this extinction event were those species that possessed characteristics that allowed them to coexist with human populations. Smaller body size was clearly advantageous, but behavioral flexibility proved equally important. Species that could modify their activity patterns, alter their diets, or adjust their habitat preferences in response to human presence were more likely to persist than those with rigid ecological requirements. wolves provide an excellent example of successful adaptation to the human-dominated landscape. Some wolf populations maintained their wild lifestyle by avoiding human settlements and focusing on prey species that humans didn't intensively hunt. But other populations took a radically different evolutionary path, developing characteristics that allowed them to live in close association with human groups. This process of domestication represented a novel evolutionary pathway that had never existed before in mammalian history. For the first time, natural selection was being influenced not just by environmental pressures, but by conscious human preferences for specific traits. The wolves that showed reduced aggression, increased trainability, and juvenile characteristics into adulthood were more likely to be tolerated and fed by human communities. The morphological changes that occurred during dog domestication happened remarkably quickly, suggesting that the genetic basis for these traits already existed in wild wolf populations. Within just a few thousand years, domestic dogs had developed floppy ears, curled tails, shortened snouts, and coat color variations that never appeared in wild wolves. These changes occurred through selective breeding that emphasized traits humans found appealing or useful. The domestication process wasn't limited to wolves. Human populations around the world independently domesticated various mammalian species that provided food, labor, or other resources. Cattle, pigs, goats, and sheep were all derived from wild ancestors through similar processes of selective breeding for docility and productivity. Each domestication event created a new evolutionary partnership between humans and other mammals. Domestic animals gained protection from predators and guaranteed access to food resources, while humans gained access to meat, milk, hides, and labor that dramatically increased their carrying capacity and technological capabilities. The development of agriculture represented another fundamental shift in mammalian ecology. For the first time in Earth's history, a single species was consciously modifying entire ecosystems to maximize the production of specific resources. The clearing of forests for agricultural fields created new habitats that favored certain mammalian species while eliminating others. Agricultural development also led to the emergence of commensal species, mammals that lived in association with human settlements without being directly domesticated. Rodents adapted to feeding on stored grain, developing populations that could reach enormous densities in agricultural areas. These commensal relationships often led to complex ecological interactions as predators followed prey into human-modified environments. The transition from hunting and gathering to agricultural societies had profound implications for human evolution as well. Permanent settlements allowed for the accumulation of material culture and the development of specialized technologies. Population densities increased dramatically, creating new selection pressures related to disease resistance and social cooperation. The genetic changes that occurred in human populations during the agricultural transition were remarkably rapid. Lactose tolerance evolved independently in multiple populations as dairy farming became economically important. Resistance to epidemic diseases increased in populations that lived in close contact with domestic animals. These changes demonstrate the speed with which mammalian evolution can occur when selection pressures are intense. As human populations grew and technological capabilities expanded, their impact on mammalian ecosystems became increasingly pronounced. The development of metallurgy allowed for more efficient hunting weapons and agricultural tools. Transportation technologies enabled humans to access previously inaccessible habitats and to transport domestic animals to new environments. The establishment of trade networks connected human populations across vast distances, facilitating the exchange of domestic animals, crops, and technologies. This cultural connectivity accelerated the rate of innovation and allowed successful adaptations to spread rapidly between populations. By the end of the Pleistocene, roughly 10,000 years ago, the mammalian world had been fundamentally transformed. The age of giants was ending, replaced by ecosystems dominated by smaller, more flexible species that could adapt to human presence. The survivors weren't necessarily the strongest or most specialized, but rather those that could maintain their ecological roles while accommodating the presence of an increasingly influential human population. The patterns established during this transition would continue to shape mammalian evolution throughout the Holocene and into the modern era. The ability to coexist with humans became one of the most important determinants of long-term survival for mammalian species. Those that could adapt to human-modified environments thrived, while those that required pristine wilderness conditions faced increasingly challenging prospects. The story of mammalian evolution during the late Pleistocene demonstrates the complex interplay between biological and cultural evolution. For the first time in Earth's history, the evolution of one species was being driven not just by natural environmental pressures, but by conscious decision-making and technological innovation. This represented a new chapter in the history of life on Earth, one where intelligence and culture could shape evolutionary outcomes as powerfully as climate and geology. The mammals that had once inherited a world devastated by asteroid impact had successfully rebuilt and diversified life on Earth. Now they were facing a new kind of challenge, one that came not from external catastrophe, but from within their own ranks. How this challenge would unfold would determine the future not just of mammals, but of all complex life on the planet. The transformation that followed the late Pleistocene extinctions wasn't immediately obvious to the survivors. In fact, for many mammalian species, the disappearance of the giants initially created more opportunities than challenges. Ecosystems that had been dominated by massive herbivores suddenly had abundant plant resources available for smaller species to exploit. Predators that had specialized in hunting megafauna either went extinct or rapidly shifted their focus to smaller prey. This ecological reshuffling set the stage for what paleontologists call the Holocene recovery, a period of mammalian adaptation and expansion that began roughly 11,700 years ago. The climate was stabilizing into the relatively warm, predictable patterns we recognize today. Ice sheets retreated to their current positions near the poles. Sea levels rose to modern configurations, separating landmasses that had been connected during glacial maxima. The mammals that thrived during this transition possessed specific characteristics that made them particularly well suited to the post-glacial world. Behavioral flexibility was perhaps the most important trait. Species that could modify their feeding strategies, alter their activity patterns, or adjust their social structures in response to changing conditions had significant advantages over those with rigid ecological requirements. Cervids, the deer family, provide an excellent example of successful Holocene adaptation. These medium-sized herbivores possessed the perfect combination of traits for the New World. They were large enough to access high-quality browse that smaller animals couldn't reach, but small enough to hide from predators and survive in fragmented habitats. Their digestive systems could handle both grasses and woody vegetation, allowing them to exploit diverse food sources as forest and grassland boundaries shifted. The social flexibility of cervids was equally important. Most species could live either solitarily or in small groups, depending on resource availability and predation pressure. During harsh winters, they could aggregate in areas with favorable microclimates. During abundant summers, they could spread out to minimize competition. This behavioral plasticity allowed them to maximize their use of variable environments. Rodents experienced perhaps the most dramatic expansion during the early Holocene. Their rapid reproductive rates and small body sizes allowed them to quickly colonize new habitats as they became available. The retreat of ice sheets exposed vast areas of previously frozen ground that were perfect for burrowing species. Changing vegetation patterns created new seed resources that granivorous rodents could exploit. The success of rodents during this period had cascading effects throughout mammalian ecosystems. Their high population densities provided abundant prey for small and medium-sized predators. Their burrowing activities modified soil structure and nutrient cycling in ways that affected plant growth patterns. Their seed dispersal activities helped establish the plant communities that would characterize Holocene landscapes. Mustelids, the weasel family, diversified rapidly to exploit the abundant small mammal prey that characterized post-glacial ecosystems. Their elongated body plans allowed them to pursue rodents into burrow systems, while their high metabolisms gave them the energy necessary for intensive hunting. Different mustelid species specialized in different hunting strategies, creating a diverse guild of small predators that could coexist in the same environments. The expansion of mustelids demonstrates how predator-prey relationships were reorganized during the Holocene transition. Instead of a few large predators hunting massive prey, ecosystems developed complex networks of smaller predators pursuing abundant small prey. This created more stable food webs that were less vulnerable to the extinction of individual species. Canids underwent their own remarkable radiation during the early Holocene. With most large predators extinct, wolves found themselves as the dominant large carnivores in many ecosystems. This ecological release allowed them to experiment with new hunting strategies and social organizations. Some populations specialized in hunting the remaining large herbivores like elk and bison. Others focused on smaller prey like deer and rodents. The behavioral flexibility that had allowed wolves to survive the Pleistocene extinctions served them well during the Holocene expansion. They could adjust their pack sizes based on prey availability, modify their territorial behaviors in response to human presence, and even alter their denning strategies to accommodate changing habitat conditions. The relationship between wolves and early human populations was complex and varied significantly across different regions. In some areas, wolves and humans competed directly for the same prey species, leading to conflict and local wolf extinctions. In other regions, wolves learned to benefit from human hunting activities by scavenging kills or following hunting parties to access wounded prey. This complex relationship eventually led to one of the most significant evolutionary developments of the Holocene period: the full domestication of dogs. Archaeological evidence suggests that dog domestication was completed by at least 15,000 years ago, making dogs the first domestic animals and humanity's oldest non-human partners. The morphological changes that distinguish dogs from wolves are remarkable not just for their extent, but for the speed at which they occurred. Domestic dogs developed shortened faces, floppy ears, curled tails, and coat color patterns that never appear in wild wolves. These changes were the result of selective breeding for juvenile characteristics, a process called neoteny that preserved puppy-like features into adulthood. But the changes weren't just physical. Dogs also developed cognitive abilities that were specifically adapted for communication with humans. They learned to interpret human pointing gestures, facial expressions, and vocal cues in ways that even closely related wolves cannot. These abilities suggest that domestication involved selection for enhanced social cognition rather than just docility. The partnership between humans and dogs had profound implications for both species' evolutionary trajectories. Dogs gained access to reliable food sources and protection from predators, while humans gained hunting partners with superior sensory abilities and tracking skills. This mutualistic relationship increased the hunting efficiency of human populations and may have contributed to their rapid expansion across the globe. The development of agriculture around 10,000 years ago represented another watershed moment in mammalian evolution. For the first time in Earth's history, a single species was systematically modifying entire landscapes to maximize the production of specific resources. The clearing of forests for agricultural fields created new habitats that favored certain mammalian species while eliminating others. Agricultural development led to the domestication of several additional mammalian species that would become crucial for human civilization. Cattle were domesticated from wild aurochs around 9,000 years ago, providing humans with milk, meat, and labor. Pigs were derived from wild boar through a similar process, while sheep and goats were domesticated from their respective wild ancestors. Each domestication event created new evolutionary pressures that shaped both the domestic animals and their wild relatives. Domestic cattle developed characteristics that made them easier to manage and more productive than their wild ancestors. They became more docile, developed different coat colors, and showed altered reproductive patterns that allowed for more frequent breeding. The wild relatives of domestic animals often faced increased pressure as human populations expanded and agricultural areas grew. Wild aurochs competed with domestic cattle for grazing areas and were sometimes hunted to prevent interbreeding with domestic herds. The last wild aurochs died in Poland in 1627, representing one of the first documented extinctions directly caused by domestication pressures. Agricultural development also created opportunities for commensal species, mammals that lived in association with human settlements without being directly managed. House mice evolved from wild ancestors that learned to exploit stored grain resources. These populations developed characteristics that distinguished them from their wild relatives, including altered reproductive patterns and behavioral changes that allowed them to live in high-density aggregations. The relationship between humans and commensal species wasn't always beneficial for humans. Rodent populations in agricultural areas could reach enormous densities that caused significant crop damage. This led to the evolution of pest management strategies, including the encouragement of predator species that could control rodent populations. Cats represent perhaps the most interesting example of semi-domestication during this period. Unlike dogs, which were actively selected and bred by humans, cats essentially domesticated themselves by exploiting the rodent populations that lived around human settlements. This self-domestication process resulted in animals that retained most of their wild behavioral characteristics while developing tolerance for human presence. The establishment of permanent human settlements created new selection pressures that affected mammalian communities in complex ways. Urban environments favored species that could tolerate noise, artificial lighting, and high population densities. These urban-adapted mammals often developed characteristics that distinguished them from their rural relatives, including altered activity patterns and modified stress responses. The development of trade networks during the Holocene facilitated the movement of both domestic animals and commensal species across vast distances. Rats and mice spread along trade routes, colonizing new continents and islands where they often had devastating impacts on native species. These biological invasions represent some of the earliest examples of human-mediated species extinctions. Island ecosystems were particularly vulnerable to introduced mammals. Many islands had evolved unique mammalian faunas in isolation, often including species that had lost anti-predator behaviors or competitive abilities. The introduction of rats, cats, and other mainland species often led to rapid extinctions of endemic island mammals. The Holocene period also saw significant changes in mammalian body size distributions. While the Pleistocene had been characterized by numerous giant species, the Holocene was dominated by smaller, more efficient forms. This shift towards smaller body sizes was partly due to climate change, but it was also influenced by human hunting pressure and habitat fragmentation. The mammals that persisted into the modern era were those that could maintain viable populations in increasingly human-dominated landscapes. This required not just biological adaptations, but also behavioral flexibility that allowed species to modify their ecological strategies in response to changing conditions. Forest fragmentation became an increasingly important factor affecting mammalian evolution during the later Holocene. As human populations expanded and agricultural areas grew, continuous forest habitats were broken into isolated patches, separated by human-modified landscapes. This fragmentation created new selection pressures that favored species with good dispersal abilities and those that could survive in small habitat patches. Edge effects became particularly important as forest fragments develop different microclimates and resource availabilities compared to continuous forests. Mammals living near forest edges often experience different predation pressures, food availabilities, and competitive interactions than those in forest interiors. These differences drove evolutionary changes that are still ongoing today. The development of transportation technologies during the later Holocene accelerated the rate of human impact on mammalian communities. Ships allowed for the rapid movement of species between continents, while roads and railways created corridors that facilitated both species movement and habitat fragmentation. These infrastructure developments created new evolutionary pressures that mammals are still adapting to today. Climate change during the Holocene, while less dramatic than Pleistocene glacial cycles, still created significant challenges for mammalian populations. The medieval warm period and Little Ice Age caused vegetation shifts that required mammalian communities to track changing habitat distributions. Species with limited dispersal abilities or narrow habitat requirements were particularly vulnerable to these climate fluctuations. The Industrial Revolution, beginning around 250 years ago, marked the start of an acceleration in human impacts on mammalian evolution that continues today. The burning of fossil fuels began altering atmospheric chemistry in ways that would eventually affect global climate patterns. Industrial development created new forms of pollution that imposed novel selection pressures on mammalian populations. Urban environments became increasingly important habitats for mammals during the industrial period. Cities created unique ecological conditions with abundant food resources, reduced predation pressure, and novel environmental challenges like air pollution and artificial lighting. The mammals that successfully colonized urban environments often developed characteristics that distinguished them from their rural relatives. The story of mammalian evolution during the Holocene demonstrates the remarkable ability of this group to adapt to rapidly changing environmental conditions. The same flexibility that had allowed mammals to survive the Pleistocene extinctions served them well as they faced the challenges of living in an increasingly human-dominated world. Their success in adapting to these new conditions would determine not just their own survival, but their ability to continue playing important ecological roles in Earth's rapidly changing ecosystems. The Holocene represents a unique period in mammalian evolution, characterized by the interaction between biological and cultural evolution in ways that had never occurred before in Earth's history. The mammals that thrived during this period were those that could navigate this new reality, finding ways to coexist with an increasingly powerful and influential human presence while maintaining their essential ecological functions. Ecological functions. The relationship between mammals and their changing world became even more intricate as human societies developed increasingly sophisticated technologies. The invention of metallurgy around 5,000 years ago marked a pivotal moment when humans could create tools and weapons that were far more durable and effective than anything made from stone or bone. This technological leap had immediate consequences for mammalian populations as metal spears, arrows, and traps made hunting significantly more efficient. Bronze Age societies developed specialized hunting equipment that could target specific species with unprecedented precision. Crossbows and compound bows allowed hunters to take down large mammals from greater distances with improved accuracy. Metal snares and traps could capture smaller mammals in quantities that would have been impossible with earlier technologies. These innovations meant that human hunting pressure was no longer limited by the availability of suitable stone for tool making. The expansion of metallurgy also enabled the development of more effective agricultural tools, which accelerated the conversion of natural habitats into farmland. Metal plows could break ground that had been too tough for wooden implements, allowing agriculture to expand into regions that had previously supported wild mammalian communities. This agricultural intensification reduced available habitat for many species, while creating new opportunities for others that could adapt to farm environments. Horses played a crucial role in this technological transformation. The domestication of horses around 6,000 years ago revolutionized human mobility and dramatically expanded the geographical range over which humans could effectively hunt and manage livestock. Mounted hunters could pursue prey across vast distances that would have been impossible to cover on foot. Horse-drawn vehicles allowed for the transport of heavy loads across continental distances, facilitating trade and cultural exchange. The partnership between humans and horses created new evolutionary pressures for wild mammals. Large herbivores that had previously been safe from human hunters due to their speed or the remoteness of their habitats suddenly became accessible to mounted hunting parties. This increased hunting pressure contributed to population declines among many large mammal species, particularly those that lived in open grassland environments where horses provided the greatest advantages. Domesticated horses themselves underwent continued evolutionary changes as different human societies selected for specific characteristics. War horses were bred for size and aggression, while riding horses were selected for speed and endurance. Draft horses developed massive muscular frames for pulling heavy loads. These selective breeding programs created distinct breeds with characteristics that would never have appeared in wild horse populations. The development of wheeled vehicles around 5,500 years ago further transformed the relationship between humans and mammals. Carts and wagons allowed for the efficient transport of goods across long distances, reducing the reliance on pack animals for trade. This transportation revolution enabled human settlements to grow larger and more specialized, as communities no longer needed to be self-sufficient in all resources. Urbanization created entirely new ecological niches that some mammals were quick to exploit. Rats and mice found abundant food sources in stored grain and organic waste. Cats followed these rodent populations into cities, establishing feral populations that could thrive without direct human management. Some bird species adapted to nesting on buildings and feeding on urban food sources, while larger mammals generally found city environments too hostile for permanent residence. The growth of cities also created demand for luxury goods that put new pressures on wild mammal populations. Fur trade networks developed to supply urban markets with pelts from animals like beavers, martens, and foxes. These trade networks could span entire continents, connecting remote trapping regions with distant urban centers. The intensity of fur trapping often led to local population crashes among target species. Maritime technology advanced significantly during this period, enabling humans to reach previously inaccessible islands and continents. The development of ocean-going vessels allowed for the transport of domestic animals to new environments where they often had dramatic impacts on native species. Pigs, goats, and cattle introduced to islands frequently caused ecological disruptions that led to extinctions among endemic mammals. The Polynesian expansion across the Pacific Ocean between 3,000 and 1,000 years ago provides a clear example of how human maritime capabilities affected mammalian evolution. As Polynesian settlers reached new islands, they brought pigs, dogs, and rats that competed with or preyed upon native species. Many island mammals that had evolved in isolation were unable to compete with these introduced species and went extinct within centuries of human arrival. European maritime expansion beginning around 500 years ago accelerated these processes on a global scale. The colonization of the Americas, Australia, and other previously isolated continents led to the introduction of numerous mammalian species to environments where they had no evolutionary history. European settlers brought cattle, horses, pigs, and sheep to every continent except Antarctica, fundamentally altering mammalian communities worldwide. The biological exchanges that occurred during this period of global exploration had profound evolutionary consequences. American mammals like llamas and alpacas were introduced to other continents, while Old World species transformed New World ecosystems. These introductions created novel competitive and predatory relationships that drove rapid evolutionary changes among both native and introduced species. Disease transmission became an increasingly important factor affecting mammalian evolution as human trade networks expanded. Domestic animals served as reservoirs for pathogens that could jump to wild species, sometimes with devastating consequences. The movement of animals along trade routes facilitated the spread of diseases across vast geographical ranges, creating new selection pressures for disease resistance. Conversely, some wild mammals served as disease reservoirs that affected human and domestic animal health. This created complex evolutionary relationships where humans, domestic animals, and wild species were all evolving in response to shared pathogen pressures. These disease dynamics often influenced human attitudes toward wild mammals, leading to persecution of species perceived as disease threats. The development of firearms around 1,000 years ago marked another technological threshold that dramatically increased human hunting efficiency. Early firearms were relatively crude, but they allowed hunters to kill large mammals from safe distances without the skill requirements of traditional weapons. As firearm technology improved, hunting pressure on wild mammals intensified correspondingly. The mass production of firearms during the Industrial Revolution made these weapons widely available, enabling large-scale commercial hunting operations that could rapidly deplete mammal populations across vast areas. The near extinction of American bison during the 19th century exemplifies how industrial-scale hunting could overwhelm the reproductive capacity of even the most abundant species. Industrial development created new forms of environmental pollution that imposed novel selection pressures on mammalian populations. Air pollution from coal burning affected respiratory health, while water pollution from industrial processes contaminated aquatic food sources. Heavy metal contamination accumulated in food chains, affecting mammalian reproduction and survival rates. These pollution pressures favored mammals with enhanced detoxification capabilities, or those that could avoid the most contaminated environments. Urban mammals often evolved increased liver function and improved ability to metabolize industrial chemicals. Rural mammals living near industrial sites showed similar adaptations, demonstrating the speed at which evolution could respond to novel environmental challenges. The construction of railroads and highways created new barriers to mammalian movement, while simultaneously creating corridors for dispersal along transportation routes. Large mammals that required extensive territories for foraging or mating were particularly affected by habitat fragmentation caused by linear infrastructure. Some species learned to use transportation corridors as movement pathways, while others were unable to cross these barriers and became isolated in habitat fragments. Railway construction also facilitated the rapid transport of goods and people across continental distances, accelerating the pace of environmental change and species introductions. The transcontinental railroads built during the 19th century enabled the efficient transport of cattle to western rangelands, fundamentally altering grassland ecosystems that had been shaped by bison for thousands of years. Agricultural intensification during the past few centuries created increasingly simplified landscapes dominated by single crop species. These agricultural monocultures supported much lower mammalian diversity than the mixed habitats they replaced. However, some generalist species thrived in agricultural environments, often reaching population densities that brought them into conflict with human interests. The development of chemical pesticides and fertilizers during the 20th century introduced another set of novel environmental pressures. These chemicals often accumulated in mammalian tissues, affecting reproduction and survival rates. Species at higher trophic levels were particularly vulnerable to bioaccumulation of persistent chemicals, leading to population declines among many carnivorous mammals. Climate change associated with industrial greenhouse gas emissions began affecting mammalian evolution during the past 2 centuries. Rising temperatures shifted vegetation zones toward higher latitudes and elevations, forcing mammals to track changing habitat distributions. Species with limited dispersal abilities or narrow climatic tolerances were particularly vulnerable to these rapid environmental changes. The pace of environmental change accelerated dramatically during the 20th century, creating evolutionary pressures that many mammalian species struggled to match. Habitat destruction, pollution, climate change, and invasive species created a complex web of challenges that tested the adaptive capabilities that had allowed mammals to dominate terrestrial ecosystems for 65 million years. Despite these challenges, many mammalian species demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. Urban adapted populations evolved altered behavior patterns, modified reproductive strategies, and enhanced tolerance for human disturbance. Some species expanded their ranges by exploiting human-created habitats, while others learned to coexist with human activities in ways that benefited both species. The conservation movement that emerged during the 20th century represented a new phase in human-mammal relationships. For the first time in history, humans began making conscious efforts to preserve mammalian species and their habitats. This shift from exploitation to conservation created new evolutionary pressures as managed populations experienced different selection regimes than their wild counterparts. Captive breeding programs developed for endangered species often involved small founding populations that experienced genetic bottlenecks. These programs had to balance the preservation of genetic diversity with the practical constraints of maintaining viable populations in artificial environments. The mammals that emerged from successful conservation programs sometimes differed genetically and behaviorally from their wild ancestors. Reintroduction programs attempted to restore mammalian species to habitats from which they had been eliminated by human activities. These efforts often revealed how quickly mammals could lose adaptations for surviving in wild environments when maintained in captivity for multiple generations. Successful reintroductions required careful attention to maintaining wild behavioral patterns and genetic diversity. The development of molecular genetics during the late 20th century provided new tools for understanding mammalian evolution and managing conservation efforts. DNA analysis revealed previously unknown relationships among mammalian species and populations, while also providing insights into the genetic basis of adaptation to human-modified environments. Genetic studies of urban mammal populations revealed rapid evolutionary changes in response to city environments. These changes included altered stress responses, modified reproductive timing, and enhanced ability to exploit human food sources. The speed of these evolutionary changes demonstrated that mammals could adapt to novel environments within decades rather than millennia. As we entered the 21st century, the relationship between humans and mammals had become more complex than at any previous point in Earth's history. Climate change, habitat destruction, and species introductions continue to create new evolutionary pressures, while conservation efforts and habitat restoration provided opportunities for recovery among previously declining species. The mammals that had once inherited a planet devastated by asteroid impact had successfully navigated 65 million years of environmental change, from greenhouse conditions to ice ages to human dominance. Their story demonstrates the remarkable power of evolutionary adaptation, but also reveals the increasing challenges facing complex life in a rapidly changing world. The future of mammalian evolution remains unwritten, shaped by the continuing interaction between biological adaptation and human technological capabilities. The same flexibility and intelligence that allowed mammals to survive previous environmental crises will determine their ability to thrive in the unprecedented conditions of the modern world. Their success will depend not just on their own adaptive capabilities, but on humanity's willingness to share the planet with the remarkable diversity of life that has emerged from those first small, warm-blooded survivors that inherited the Earth so long ago. The story of how mammals came to dominate our planet reaches its most crucial turning point when we consider what happened next. By the dawn of the modern era, mammals had not only survived multiple mass extinctions and dramatic climate shifts, but they had fundamentally reshaped the very nature of life on Earth. The warm-blooded revolution that began in the shadows of dinosaurs had created a biological empire spanning every continent and ocean. But here's where the story takes its most remarkable turn. Around 200,000 years ago, one particular lineage of mammals began exhibiting behaviors that would prove more transformative than any previous evolutionary development. Early humans weren't just another successful mammalian species adapting to their environment. They represented something entirely unprecedented in the history of complex life. A species capable of consciously directing evolutionary change. The cognitive revolution that occurred in human populations between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago marked the beginning of what scientists call the Anthropocene, an era where human activity became the dominant force shaping planetary ecosystems. This wasn't simply a matter of one species becoming more successful than others. It represented a fundamental shift in how evolution itself would operate. Traditional natural selection had always been driven by environmental pressures that were largely beyond the control of individual organisms. Climate changes, geological events, and ecological interactions determined which traits were advantageous and which led to extinction. But humans developed the ability to modify their environment intentionally, creating artificial selection pressures that could override natural evolutionary processes. The domestication of wolves into dogs provides the clearest early example of this new evolutionary dynamic. Archaeological evidence from sites across Eurasia shows that this transformation occurred independently in multiple regions, suggesting that the process was both inevitable and remarkably rapid once the right conditions emerged. What makes this domestication so significant isn't just that humans gained a useful partner, but that they demonstrated the ability to reshape another species according to their own preferences. The morphological changes that occurred during dog domestication happened at speeds that would have been impossible under natural selection alone. Within just a few thousand years, domestic dogs developed shortened faces, floppy ears, curled tails, and coat patterns that never appear in wild wolf populations. These changes occurred because humans were selecting for traits they found appealing or useful, creating selection pressures that were entirely artificial. But the relationship between humans and dogs was more than just one-way manipulation. Dogs also evolved enhanced abilities to communicate with humans, including the capacity to interpret pointing gestures, facial expressions, and vocal cues that even their close relatives among wolves cannot understand. This suggests that domestication involved mutual adaptation, with both species evolving characteristics that improved their partnership. The agricultural revolution that began around 10,000 years ago represented an even more dramatic intervention in natural evolutionary processes. For the first time in Earth's history, a single species was systematically modifying entire landscapes to maximize the production of specific resources. The development of crop cultivation and livestock management created controlled environments where humans could direct the evolution of multiple species simultaneously. Wheat, barley, rice, and maize all underwent rapid evolutionary changes as humans selected for larger seeds, synchronized ripening, and reduced seed dispersal. These crops became so dependent on human management that they could no longer survive in wild environments. Similarly, cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats all developed characteristics that made them more useful to humans, but less capable of surviving independently. This co-evolutionary relationship between humans and their domestic species created what scientists call an evolutionary ratchet. Once societies became dependent on agriculture, there was no evolutionary path back to hunting and gathering lifestyles. The domesticated species couldn't survive without human care, and human populations had grown too large to be supported by wild resources alone. The ecological consequences of agricultural expansion were immediate and dramatic. Forest clearance for farmland eliminated habitat for countless wild mammal species while creating new niches for others that could adapt to human-modified environments. Rodent populations exploded in agricultural areas where stored grain provided abundant food resources. This in turn attracted predators like cats, which began their own process of semi-domestication around human settlements. The development of permanent settlements created urban environments that imposed entirely new selection pressures on mammalian populations. City conditions favoured species that could tolerate high population densities, artificial lighting, and constant human activity. Many urban mammals evolved altered circadian rhythms, modified stress responses, and enhanced cognitive abilities for navigating complex human-created environments. Rats provide perhaps the best example of rapid urban adaptation. House rats evolved from wild ancestors that learned to exploit human food sources, developing characteristics that distinguished them from their forest-dwelling relatives. Urban rat populations showed enhanced learning abilities, altered reproductive patterns, and improved tolerance for the toxins and pollutants common in city environments. The globalization that occurred during the past 500 years created opportunities for unprecedented biological mixing as humans transported species across oceanic barriers that had separated continental faunas for millions of years. European colonization introduced horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep to the Americas, while New World species like llamas were transported to other continents. These introductions created novel competitive relationships that drove rapid evolutionary changes among both native and introduced species. Island ecosystems were particularly vulnerable to these biological invasions. Many islands had evolved unique mammalian faunas in isolation, often including species that had lost anti-predator behaviors or competitive abilities. The introduction of cats, rats, and ungulates to oceanic islands led to wave after wave of extinctions among endemic species that had no evolutionary experience with these mainland competitors. The Industrial Revolution that began around 250 years ago marked another acceleration in human impacts on mammalian evolution. The burning of fossil fuels began altering atmospheric chemistry, while industrial development created new forms of pollution that imposed novel selection pressures. Heavy metals, synthetic chemicals, and radioactive materials accumulated in food webs, affecting mammalian reproduction and survival rates. Urban air pollution, selected for mammals with enhanced respiratory efficiency and improved detoxification capabilities. Populations living near industrial sites often evolved increased liver function and better ability to metabolize synthetic chemicals. These adaptations occurred within decades rather than millennia, demonstrating the speed at which mammalian evolution could respond to intense selection pressures. Transportation infrastructure created new barriers to mammalian movement while simultaneously providing corridors for dispersal. Highways and railways fragmented habitats for large mammals that required extensive territories, while smaller species learned to use transportation corridors as movement pathways. Some mammals even evolved behavioral adaptations for avoiding vehicle traffic, including altered activity patterns and enhanced acoustic sensitivity. The conservation movement that emerged during the 20th century represented yet another novel evolutionary force. For the first time in history, humans began making conscious efforts to preserve endangered species through captive breeding and habitat protection. These conservation programs created artificial selection pressures as small founding populations experienced genetic bottlenecks and adaptation to captive conditions. Captive breeding programs often involve trade-offs between preserving genetic diversity and maintaining behavioral traits necessary for survival in wild environments. Mammals raised in captivity for multiple generations sometimes lost critical survival skills, requiring extensive rehabilitation before they could be successfully reintroduced to natural habitats. Climate change associated with greenhouse gas emissions has become an increasingly important driver of mammalian evolution during the past century. Rising temperatures are shifting vegetation zones toward higher latitudes and elevations, forcing mammals to track changing habitat distributions. Species with limited dispersal abilities face local extinctions, while those capable of rapid range shifts may encounter novel environmental conditions that favor different traits. Arctic mammals face particularly intense climate pressures as sea ice disappears and tundra ecosystems shift toward forest vegetation. Polar bears are experiencing selection for enhanced swimming ability and altered hunting strategies as their traditional ice-based hunting grounds become unreliable. Caribou populations are adapting to changing migration routes as traditional pathways become disrupted by altered weather patterns. The molecular revolution in genetics has provided new tools for understanding and potentially directing mammalian evolution. DNA sequencing technologies allow scientists to identify the genetic basis of adaptive traits and track evolutionary changes in real time. CRISPR gene editing techniques raise the possibility of directly modifying mammalian genomes to enhance survival in changing environments. These genetic technologies create ethical dilemmas about the appropriate extent of human intervention in evolutionary processes. Should humans use genetic engineering to help endangered species adapt to climate change? What are the risks of creating genetically modified organisms that might escape into wild populations? These questions represent entirely new categories of evolutionary decision-making that no species has ever faced before. Synthetic biology approaches are being developed to recreate extinct mammalian species through genetic reconstruction. Projects aimed at resurrecting woolly mammoths, passenger pigeons, and other recently extinct species use DNA from preserved specimens to guide the modification of closely related living species. These de-extinction efforts could potentially restore ecological functions that were lost when key species disappeared. The urban environments that now house more than half of humanity have become important laboratories for studying rapid mammalian evolution. City-dwelling mammals often show remarkable adaptations to human-dominated landscapes, including altered foraging behaviors, modified social structures, and enhanced cognitive abilities. These urban adaptations provide insights into the flexibility of mammalian evolution and the potential for coexistence in human-dominated futures. Some urban mammals have developed extraordinary problem-solving abilities for accessing human food sources. Raccoons in cities show enhanced manual dexterity and tool use compared to their rural relatives. Urban coyotes have learned to navigate traffic patterns and exploit garbage resources while avoiding human detection. These behavioral innovations often spread through populations via social learning, creating cultural evolution that operates alongside genetic changes. The future trajectory of mammalian evolution will likely be determined by the continuing interaction between biological adaptation and human technological capabilities. Climate change, habitat destruction, and invasive species will continue creating new evolutionary challenges, while conservation efforts and habitat restoration may provide opportunities for recovery among declining species. Emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and biotechnology could provide new tools for monitoring and potentially guiding evolutionary processes. Real-time genetic monitoring could allow scientists to track adaptive changes as they occur, while predictive modeling might identify species at risk before population crashes occur. The relationship between humans and other mammals has evolved from simple predator-prey interactions to complex partnerships and dependencies that span the globe. Domestic animals have become so integrated into human societies that their welfare is often prioritized above that of wild species. This creates tension between conservation goals and agricultural interests that will likely intensify as human populations continue growing. Space exploration represents the newest frontier for mammalian evolution as humans begin establishing permanent settlements beyond Earth. The extreme environments of space and other planets will create selection pressures unlike anything experienced during terrestrial evolution. Mammals living in space habitats may evolve adaptations for microgravity, radiation exposure, and artificial atmospheric conditions. The story of mammalian evolution demonstrates the remarkable adaptability that allowed this group to survive and thrive through 65 million years of environmental change. From the first small creatures that inherited a devastated planet to the diverse array of species that populate modern ecosystems, mammals have consistently shown the flexibility necessary for evolutionary success. But the challenges facing mammals today are unprecedented in their speed and complexity. Climate change, habitat destruction, pollution, and invasive species are creating conditions that test the limits of adaptive capability. The mammals that survive into the future will be those that can either adapt rapidly to human-dominated environments or find ways to coexist with an increasingly technological civilization. The warm-blooded revolution that began in the aftermath of the dinosaur extinction has led to this moment where one mammalian species holds the power to determine the evolutionary fate of all others. How that power is used will determine not just the future of mammals, but the trajectory of complex life on Earth for millions of years to come. The inheritance that began with small creatures warming themselves in the darkness has become a responsibility that extends across the entire biosphere. The next chapter in mammalian evolution will be written by conscious choice rather than natural selection alone, marking a transition as significant as any in the history of life on our remarkable planet. Looking at this transformed world, we need to understand that what we're witnessing isn't just another chapter in evolutionary history. This is the moment when biological evolution itself became conscious of its own processes. The mammals that had spent millions of years adapting to environmental changes suddenly found themselves living alongside a species that could predict, plan, and purposefully alter those very environments. The archaeological record from the last 50,000 years reveals a pattern of human expansion that coincides remarkably with mammalian extinctions across every continent except Africa. But this wasn't a simple case of overhunting. What we see instead is evidence of a complex interaction between climate instability, habitat fragmentation, and the introduction of a completely novel predator with capabilities that no previous species had ever possessed. In Australia, the arrival of humans around 65,000 years ago coincided with the disappearance of the continent's megafauna within just a few millennia. Diprotodon, a massive marsupial the size of a rhinoceros, vanished along with giant kangaroos, enormous flightless birds, and marsupial lions. These weren't gradual extinctions spread across tens of thousands of years. They happened with shocking rapidity once human populations established themselves across the continent. The pattern repeated itself in the Americas when humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge around 15,000 years ago. Within 2,000 years, North and South America had lost over 80% of their large mammal species. Ground sloths the size of elephants disappeared. Saber-toothed cats went extinct. Giant beavers, massive armadillos, and enormous bears all vanished from ecosystems where they had thrived for millions of years. What made humans so uniquely devastating wasn't just their hunting prowess, though that was certainly significant. Archaeological sites reveal sophisticated hunting strategies that involved entire communities working together to drive herds over cliffs or into constructed traps. These coordinated efforts could kill dozens of large animals simultaneously, providing far more meat than immediate consumption required. But humans brought something else entirely: fire. The controlled use of fire allowed human populations to reshape entire landscapes in ways that fundamentally altered habitat availability for other mammals. Regular burning maintained open grasslands that might otherwise have reverted to forest. This landscape modification created conditions that favored some species while disadvantaging others, essentially allowing humans to engineer ecosystems according to their preferences. The impact of human fire management extended far beyond direct habitat modification. Many large herbivores had evolved in ecosystems shaped by natural fire cycles that occurred every few decades. Human-managed burning created fire frequencies that were often annual or biannual, completely disrupting the plant communities that these animals depended upon. Species adapted to browsing in dense forests found themselves in increasingly open landscapes with fundamentally different food resources. Climate change during the late Pleistocene complicated these human impacts in ways that made survival even more challenging for large mammals. The world was transitioning out of the last ice age, with temperatures rising and sea levels climbing. Habitat distributions were shifting northward as ice sheets retreated, but the rate of change was unprecedented in recent geological history. Large mammals that had survived previous climate transitions by migrating to new habitats now found their traditional migration routes blocked by human settlements or altered by human landscape management. Populations that might have tracked changing conditions across hundreds of kilometers found themselves confined to increasingly isolated habitat fragments. The fossil evidence from this period reveals something remarkable about mammalian adaptability under extreme pressure. Some species showed rapid evolutionary responses to human presence, developing altered behavior patterns within just a few generations. Bison populations in North America became more vigilant and developed enhanced sensitivity to human scents and sounds. Wolves learned to avoid human settlements while maintaining their traditional hunting territories in more remote regions. These behavioral adaptations represented real-time evolution in action. The mammals that survived were those whose genetic makeup allowed for rapid behavioral modification in response to novel threats. This flexibility had always been a mammalian strength, but never before had it been tested by such intense and rapidly changing selection pressures. The development of agriculture around 10,000 years ago marked another fundamental transition in human-mammal relationships. For the first time, humans began actively managing entire ecosystems to maximize the production of specific resources. This wasn't just hunting or gathering from natural systems. It was the conscious redesign of landscapes to support human-preferred species while excluding others. Agricultural development required the clearing of vast forest areas for crop cultivation. These cleared lands created edge habitats that favored certain mammalian species while eliminating others entirely. Deer populations often increased in agricultural regions because they could exploit both crop plants and the forest edges that bordered farmland. Conversely, deep forest specialists found their habitat increasingly fragmented and their populations correspondingly reduced. The domestication of livestock created another layer of complexity in mammalian evolution. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs all underwent rapid evolutionary changes as humans selected for traits that made them more productive or easier to manage. These domestic animals developed characteristics that would never have appeared in wild populations: enhanced milk production, altered reproductive cycles, modified behavior patterns, and sometimes dramatically changed physical appearance. But domestication wasn't a one-way process. The wild relatives of domestic animals often experienced increased competition and hunting pressure as agricultural societies expanded. Wild boar competed with domestic pigs for forest resources. Wild sheep and goats found themselves excluded from traditional grazing areas that were now reserved for domestic herds. These competitive pressures drove some wild populations toward extinction while forcing others to adapt to more marginal habitats. The emergence of permanent human settlements created entirely new ecological niches that some mammals were remarkably quick to exploit. Rodent populations exploded around agricultural communities, where stored grain provided abundant, predictable food sources. These commensal relationships often led to evolutionary changes as rodents adapted to living in high-density aggregations under artificial shelter conditions. House mice provide a fascinating example of rapid evolutionary change in human-dominated environments. Archaeological evidence shows that these animals evolved from wild ancestors that began exploiting stored grain resources in early agricultural settlements. Within just a few thousand years, house mice had developed characteristics that distinguished them from their wild relatives. Altered reproductive patterns, modified social behaviors, and enhanced ability to survive in the artificial conditions of human dwellings. Cats followed rodents into human settlements, establishing one of the most interesting examples of semi-domestication in mammalian history. Unlike dogs, which were actively selected and bred by humans, cats essentially domesticated themselves by exploiting the abundant rodent populations that lived around agricultural communities. This self-domestication process resulted in animals that retained most of their wild hunting behaviors while developing tolerance for human proximity. The relationship between humans and cats demonstrates how mammalian evolution could be driven by indirect human influence rather than conscious selection. Cats that were less fearful of humans gained access to the rich hunting opportunities provided by commensal rodent populations. Over time, this created selection pressure for reduced fear responses and enhanced ability to coexist with human activity. Trade networks that developed during the Bronze Age facilitated the movement of both domestic animals and commensal species across vast geographical distances. Rats and mice spread along trade routes, often reaching new continents as stowaways on merchant vessels. These biological invasions had profound impacts on native mammalian communities, particularly on islands where endemic species had evolved without exposure to mainland competitors. The Polynesian expansion across the Pacific Ocean between 3,000 and 1,000 years ago provides clear documentation of how human colonization affected island mammalian faunas. As Polynesian settlers reached new islands, they brought pigs, dogs, and rats that competed with or preyed upon native species. Archaeological evidence shows that many islands lost significant portions of their endemic mammalian diversity within centuries of human arrival. European maritime exploration beginning around 500 years ago accelerated these processes on a global scale. The colonization of the Americas, Australia, and remote islands led to unprecedented biological mixing as European settlers introduced familiar domestic animals to environments where they had no evolutionary history. Horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep transformed ecosystems across multiple continents, creating novel competitive relationships that drove rapid evolutionary changes. The introduction of horses to the Americas had particularly dramatic consequences for both human societies and native mammalian communities. Native American populations rapidly adopted horse-based lifestyles that allowed them to hunt bison more efficiently across vast territories. This increased hunting pressure, combined with habitat changes caused by overgrazing from introduced livestock, contributed to significant population declines among native herbivores. Disease transmission became an increasingly important factor affecting mammalian evolution as global trade networks expanded. Domestic animals served as reservoirs for pathogens that could jump to wild species, sometimes with devastating consequences. The movement of livestock along trade routes facilitated the spread of diseases across geographical barriers that had previously isolated different pathogen communities. Conversely, wild mammals sometimes served as disease reservoirs that affected human and domestic animal health. These disease dynamics created complex evolutionary relationships where humans, domestic animals, and wild species were all evolving in response to shared pathogen pressures. The speed of pathogen evolution often outpaced mammalian immune responses, creating ongoing cycles of disease emergence and adaptive response. The development of firearms technology represented another threshold that dramatically altered human hunting capabilities. Early firearms allowed hunters to kill large mammals from safe distances without requiring the extensive training necessary for traditional weapons. As firearm technology improved throughout the Renaissance and early modern periods, hunting pressure on wild mammalian populations intensified correspondingly. Commercial hunting operations that emerged during the 18th and 19th centuries could rapidly deplete mammalian populations across vast areas. The near extinction of American bison during the 19th century exemplifies how industrial-scale hunting could overwhelm the reproductive capacity of even the most abundant species. Archaeological evidence suggests that bison populations crashed from an estimated 30 to 60 million animals to fewer than 1,000 within just a few decades. The Industrial Revolution that began around 1750 marked the start of an acceleration in human environmental impacts that continues today. The burning of fossil fuels began altering atmospheric chemistry, while industrial development created new forms of pollution that imposed novel selection pressures on mammalian populations. Coal smoke, heavy metal contamination, and industrial chemicals accumulated in food webs, affecting mammalian reproduction and survival rates. Urban environments became increasingly important habitats for mammals as human populations concentrated in cities during the industrial period. City conditions created unique ecological pressures. Abundant food sources in the form of garbage and stored goods reduced predation pressure due to the elimination of large predators, but also novel environmental challenges like air pollution, noise, and artificial lighting. The mammals that successfully colonized urban environments often developed characteristics that distinguished them from their rural relatives. Urban rat populations showed enhanced problem-solving abilities and improved tolerance for environmental toxins. City-dwelling birds modified their singing patterns to communicate over traffic noise. These adaptations occurred within decades rather than centuries, demonstrating the remarkable speed at which mammalian evolution could respond to intense environmental pressure. Railroad construction during the 19th century created new barriers to mammalian movement, while simultaneously providing corridors for dispersal along transportation routes. Large mammals that required extensive territories for foraging or reproduction were particularly affected by habitat fragmentation caused by railway lines. Some species learned to time their movements to avoid trains, while others were unable to adapt to these linear barriers and experienced population fragmentation. The transcontinental railroads built during this period also facilitated the rapid transport of goods and people across continental distances, accelerating the pace of environmental change and species introductions. Railway transport enabled the efficient movement of cattle to western rangelands, fundamentally altering grassland ecosystems that had been shaped by native bison herds for thousands of years. Agricultural intensification during the 19th and 20th centuries created increasingly simplified landscapes dominated by single-crop species. These agricultural monocultures supported much lower mammalian diversity than the mixed habitats they replaced. However, some generalist species thrived in these simplified environments, often reaching population densities that brought them into conflict with agricultural interests. The development of chemical pesticides and fertilizers during the 20th century introduced another set of novel environmental pressures that affected mammalian evolution. These synthetic chemicals often accumulated in mammalian tissues through bioaccumulation processes, affecting reproduction and survival rates. Predatory mammals at higher trophic levels were particularly vulnerable to chemical contamination, leading to population declines among many carnivorous species. DDT contamination during the mid-20th century provides a clear example of how industrial chemicals could affect mammalian evolution through both direct toxicity and indirect effects on prey species. Mammals that fed on contaminated prey often experienced reproductive failures, while those with enhanced detoxification capabilities had significant survival advantages. These selection pressures favored genetic variants that could better metabolize synthetic chemicals. Climate change associated with greenhouse gas emissions began affecting mammalian evolution during the 20th century, as atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations rose above levels seen in millions of years. Rising temperatures shifted vegetation zones toward higher latitudes and elevations, forcing mammals to track changing habitat distributions or adapt to altered local conditions. Arctic mammals faced particularly intense climate pressures as sea ice extent declined and tundra ecosystems shifted toward forest vegetation. Polar bear populations experienced selection for enhanced swimming ability and altered hunting strategies as their traditional ice-based hunting grounds became less reliable. Caribou herds adapted to changing migration routes as traditional pathways were disrupted by altered precipitation patterns and vegetation changes. The conservation movement that emerged during the 20th century represented a novel phase in human-mammalian relationships. For the first time in history, humans began making systematic efforts to preserve endangered species through habitat protection and captive breeding programs. These conservation efforts created new evolutionary pressures, as managed populations experienced different selection regimes than their wild counterparts. Captive breeding programs often involve small founding populations that experience genetic bottlenecks and adaptation to artificial environments. The mammals that emerged from successful breeding programs sometimes differed genetically and behaviorally from their wild ancestors, requiring careful management to maintain traits necessary for survival in natural habitats. Reintroduction programs attempted to restore mammalian species to habitats from which they had been eliminated by human activities. These efforts often revealed how quickly mammals could lose adaptations for surviving in wild environments when maintained in captivity for multiple generations. Successful reintroductions required careful attention to maintaining natural behavioral patterns and genetic diversity. The development of molecular genetics during the late 20th century provided unprecedented insights into mammalian evolutionary processes and population dynamics. DNA analysis revealed previously unknown relationships among species and populations, while also providing tools for monitoring genetic diversity in wild and captive populations. These genetic techniques revolutionized conservation biology and wildlife management practices. Population genetic studies revealed that many apparently stable mammalian populations were actually experiencing ongoing evolutionary changes in response to human activities. Urban mammal populations showed rapid genetic changes associated with adaptation to city environments, including altered stress responses, modified reproductive timing, and enhanced tolerance for environmental contaminants. As we entered the 21st century, the relationship between humans and mammals had become more complex than at any previous point in Earth's 4.6 billion year history. Climate change, habitat destruction, invasive species, and pollution continued to create new evolutionary pressures, while conservation efforts and habitat restoration provided opportunities for recovery among previously declining species. Emerging technologies like satellite tracking, automated monitoring systems, and genetic analysis provided new tools for understanding mammalian responses to environmental change in real time. These technologies revealed that mammalian evolution was continuing to occur at rapid rates in response to human activities, with some species showing measurable genetic changes within just a few generations. The mammals that had inherited a devastated planet 66 million years ago had successfully navigated multiple mass extinctions, dramatic climate changes, and continental drift. Their story demonstrates the remarkable power of evolutionary adaptation through flexibility, intelligence, and the revolutionary innovations of warm-bloodedness and parental care. But the challenges facing mammals today are unprecedented in their complexity and speed. The intersection of climate change, habitat destruction, pollution, and invasive species creates a web of environmental pressures that test the limits of adaptive capability. The mammals that survive into the future will be those that can either adapt rapidly to human-dominated environments or find ways to benefit from association with human activities. The success of mammalian evolution has always depended on flexibility and innovation in the face of environmental challenges. These same qualities will determine whether mammals can continue to thrive as the planet enters an era dominated by a single species with the power to alter global climate, reshape entire continents, and direct the evolutionary fate of every other living thing. The warm-blooded revolution that began in the darkness of a post-impact world has led to this moment of unprecedented responsibility and opportunity. How that legacy is managed will determine not just the future of mammals, but the trajectory of complex life on Earth for millions of years to come. The story we've been following reaches its most profound transformation when we realize that mammals didn't just adapt to change, they became the agents of change themselves. What began as small creatures surviving in the shadows had evolved into something unprecedented in Earth's history. A biological system capable of conscious environmental modification on a planetary scale. The past 200,000 years represent more than just another chapter in mammalian evolution. This period marks the emergence of cognitive abilities that would fundamentally alter how evolution itself operates on our planet. Early humans possessed something that no previous species had ever developed: the capacity to imagine future scenarios and deliberately modify their environment to achieve desired outcomes. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa reveals sophisticated tool technologies dating back 300,000 years. These weren't simple modifications of natural objects, but carefully planned implements that required multiple steps of preparation and demonstrated clear understanding of cause and effect relationships. Stone tools required the ability to visualize the final product before beginning the knapping process, then execute precise strikes to achieve that predetermined goal. The controlled use of fire represents perhaps the most significant technological breakthrough in mammalian history. Evidence from sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa suggests that humans were managing fire over 1 million years ago. This wasn't just opportunistic use of natural fires, but deliberate ignition and maintenance of flames for cooking, warmth, and landscape modification. Fire management allowed human populations to transform entire ecosystems in ways that had never been possible for any previous mammalian species. Regular burning could maintain grassland environments that might otherwise revert to forest. This landscape modification created conditions that favored certain prey species while disadvantaging others, essentially allowing humans to engineer their own hunting grounds. The expansion of human populations out of Africa, beginning around 70,000 years ago, coincided with one of the most dramatic waves of mammalian extinctions in Earth's history. But this wasn't a simple case of overhunting. Archaeological evidence suggests that human impacts were far more complex, involving habitat modification, introduction of novel diseases, and disruption of established ecological relationships. In Australia, human arrival around 65,000 years ago coincided with the disappearance of over 90% of large mammalian species within just a few millennia. Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived, vanished along with giant kangaroos, massive wombats, and marsupial lions. These extinctions happened with unprecedented speed, suggesting that human impacts went far beyond direct hunting pressure. The pattern repeated across every continent that humans colonized. In Europe, the woolly rhinoceros, cave bear, and giant deer all disappeared within thousands of years of human population expansion. In the Americas, over 80% of large mammalian species went extinct following human arrival around 15,000 years ago. Ground sloths the size of elephants, saber-toothed cats, and giant beavers all vanished from ecosystems where they had thrived for millions of years. What made human impact so uniquely devastating wasn't just hunting efficiency, though coordinated group hunting strategies were certainly significant. Archaeological sites reveal evidence of sophisticated game drives where entire communities work together to channel herds toward kill sites. These operations could harvest dozens of large animals simultaneously, providing far more resources than immediate consumption required. The development of projectile weapons represented a crucial technological threshold that fundamentally altered predator-prey relationships. Spear throwers allowed hunters to deliver projectiles with accuracy and force that exceeded any natural biological system. This gave humans the ability to hunt animals much larger than themselves, while maintaining safe distances from dangerous prey. But perhaps most significantly, humans brought complex social coordination capabilities that allowed them to share information across vast geographical ranges. Knowledge about animal behavior, migration routes, and seasonal patterns could be transmitted between groups and preserved across generations. This cultural information system allowed human hunting strategies to become increasingly sophisticated over time. Climate change during the late Pleistocene complicated these human impacts in ways that made survival even more challenging for large mammals. The transition out of the last ice age involved temperature increases and habitat shifts that were occurring faster than many species could adapt. Traditional migration routes became disrupted as ice sheets retreated and sea levels rose. Large mammals that had survived previous climate transitions by moving to new habitats now found their pathways blocked by human settlements or altered by human landscape management. Populations that might have tracked changing conditions across hundreds of kilometers found themselves confined to increasingly isolated habitat fragments. The fossil record from this period reveals remarkable evidence of mammalian behavioral adaptation under extreme pressure. Some species showed rapid evolutionary responses to human presence, developing enhanced vigilance and altered activity patterns within just a few generations. Bison populations learned to avoid areas with human scent markers. Wolves modified their hunting territories to minimize encounters with human groups. These behavioral changes represent real-time evolution in action. The mammals that survived the human expansion were those whose genetic makeup allowed for rapid modification of instinctive behaviors. This flexibility had always been a mammalian strength, but never before had it been tested by such intense and rapidly changing selection pressures. The development of agriculture around 10,000 years ago marked another fundamental transition in mammalian evolution. For the first time in Earth's history, a single species was systematically redesigning entire landscapes to maximize production of specific resources. This wasn't just exploitation of existing ecosystems, but conscious creation of artificial environments optimized for human needs. Agricultural development required clearing vast forest areas for crop cultivation and livestock management. These landscape modifications created mosaic environments with sharp boundaries between managed and unmanaged areas. Some mammalian species thrived in these edge habitats, while others found their traditional territories completely eliminated. The domestication process that created modern livestock represents one of the most rapid evolutionary transformations ever documented. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs all underwent dramatic morphological and behavioral changes within just a few thousand years of human management. These changes occurred through artificial selection pressures that were far more intense than anything possible under natural conditions. Domestic cattle developed enhanced milk production capabilities that far exceeded what would be necessary for raising their own offspring. Sheep evolved wool production that required regular human shearing to prevent overheating. Pigs developed increased fat deposition and accelerated growth rates that would be disadvantageous in wild environments. These characteristics demonstrate how rapidly mammalian biology could be reshaped when selection pressures were consciously directed. But domestication wasn't a one-way process. The wild relatives of domestic animals often experienced increased competition as agricultural societies expanded. Wild boar found themselves competing with domestic pigs for forest resources. Wild sheep and goats were excluded from traditional grazing areas that were now reserved for managed herds. These competitive pressures forced wild populations into increasingly marginal habitats. Urban environments that developed around agricultural settlements created entirely new ecological niches that some mammals were remarkably quick to exploit. Rodent populations exploded around human communities where stored grain provided abundant, predictable food sources. These commensal relationships led to rapid evolutionary changes as species adapted to living in artificial shelter conditions. House mice provide a fascinating example of rapid urban adaptation. Archaeological evidence shows that these animals evolved from wild ancestors within just a few thousand years of agricultural development. Urban mouse populations developed altered reproductive patterns, modified social behaviors, and enhanced tolerance for high population densities that would be impossible in natural environments. Cats followed rodent populations into human settlements, establishing one of the most successful examples of semi-domestication in mammalian history. Unlike dogs, which were actively bred by humans, cats essentially domesticated themselves by exploiting abundant prey resources around agricultural communities. This process selected for reduced fear responses and enhanced ability to coexist with human activity. Trade networks that emerged during the Bronze Age facilitated unprecedented movement of species across geographical barriers. Domestic animals were transported to new continents where they often had dramatic impacts on native ecosystems. Horses introduced to the Americas transformed both human societies and mammalian communities across vast territories. Maritime exploration, beginning around 500 years ago, accelerated these biological exchanges on a global scale. European colonization introduced familiar domestic species to environments where they had no evolutionary history. The ecological consequences were often devastating for native mammalian communities, particularly on islands where endemic species had evolved without exposure to mainland competitors. The Industrial Revolution that began around 250 years ago marked another acceleration in human environmental impacts. Fossil fuel combustion began altering atmospheric chemistry in ways that would eventually affect global climate patterns. Industrial development created new forms of pollution that imposed novel selection pressures on mammalian populations. Urban air pollution selected for mammals with enhanced respiratory capabilities and improved detoxification systems. Populations living near industrial sites often evolved increased liver function and better ability to metabolize synthetic chemicals. These adaptations occurred within decades rather than centuries, demonstrating unprecedented speeds of evolutionary response. Transportation infrastructure created new barriers to mammalian movement while simultaneously providing dispersal corridors. Railways and highways fragmented habitats for large mammals, while smaller species learned to exploit transportation routes for movement between habitat patches. Some mammals even evolved behavioral adaptations for avoiding vehicle traffic. The conservation movement that emerged during the 20th century represented a novel phase in human-mammalian relationships. For the first time, humans began systematic efforts to preserve endangered species through habitat protection and captive breeding programs. These conservation efforts created artificial selection pressures as managed populations adapted to captive conditions. Climate change, associated with greenhouse gas emissions, has become an increasingly dominant force affecting mammalian evolution. Rising temperatures are shifting vegetation zones faster than many species can track through migration. Arctic mammals face particularly intense pressures as sea ice disappears and tundra ecosystems transition toward forest vegetation. Molecular genetic technologies developed during the late 20th century provided unprecedented insights into mammalian evolutionary processes. DNA analysis revealed that many apparently stable populations were actually experiencing ongoing genetic changes in response to human activities. Urban mammal populations showed rapid evolution of traits associated with city environments. As we've entered the 21st century, the relationship between humans and other mammals has become more complex than at any point in Earth's history. Climate change, habitat destruction, and invasive species continue creating new evolutionary pressures, while conservation efforts provide opportunities for recovery among declining species. The mammals that inherited a devastated planet 66 million years ago successfully navigated multiple mass extinctions, dramatic climate changes, and continental drift through flexibility, intelligence, and revolutionary biological innovations. These same qualities will determine whether mammals can continue thriving as Earth enters an era dominated by a single species with unprecedented power to alter planetary systems. The warm-blooded revolution that began in darkness has led to this moment, where mammalian intelligence has become capable of directing evolutionary change itself. How this capability is used will determine not just the future of mammals, but the trajectory of all complex life on our remarkable planet for millions of years to come. Millions of years to come. And so we reach the end of this extraordinary journey through time. A story that began with catastrophe and transformed into something magnificent beyond imagination. What we've witnessed isn't just the rise of a single group of animals, it's the emergence of an entirely new way of being alive on planet Earth. From those first small, warm-blooded survivors scurrying through the darkness of a post-apocalyptic world, mammals didn't just fill the empty spaces left by the dinosaurs. They rewrote the rules of what complex life could become. They invented internal temperature control that freed them from environmental constraints. They developed sophisticated sensory systems that turned darkness into opportunity. They pioneered parental care that transformed reproduction from abandonment into investment. But perhaps most remarkably, they gave rise to consciousness itself. That journey from tiny insectivores hiding in burrows to species capable of contemplating their own existence represents one of the most profound transformations in the history of our planet. The same biological innovations that allowed early mammals to survive in the shadows eventually produced minds capable of understanding those very innovations. Today, as we face unprecedented environmental challenges, the mammalian story offers both inspiration and responsibility. The flexibility, intelligence, and cooperative behaviors that allowed mammals to thrive through 66 million years of planetary change are the very qualities we'll need to navigate the uncertain future ahead. The warm-blooded revolution that began in darkness has brought us to a moment where we hold the power to shape evolution itself. The inheritance is profound, the responsibility immense, and the possibilities endless. The small creatures that once warmed themselves against the cold of an empty world have become the guardians of life's next chapter. What story will we write next? The answer lies not in the fossils of the past, but in the choices we make today. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through deep time. If you enjoyed this exploration of our planet's remarkable history, don't forget to like and subscribe for more adventures into the ancient world. Until next time, keep looking up at the stars and back through time.